welcome back. This is week 3 of our stewardship unit. We're working from the Smith and Hellway's formation series. And this week we'll be in Luke chapter 16, which is a continuation of what we talked about last week. Today we're going to be talking about the story of Lazarus in one of Jesus' parables. And this week our title of our lesson is Responsibility. And the central question challenges us with, what is my responsibility towards others? You know, this month as we've talked about stewardship, we've made the point that stewardship is about more than money. It's about wealth. You know, really the word that is translated, we've talked about, comes from the Aramaic mammon, which really loosely translated, Christie, means our stuff. So it's really everything that we have. And so today we'll be taking a look at what is our responsibility with these treasures, with this wealth, with these possessions, with this mammon that we have. You know, what is our treasures? You know, what is our responsibility to do with those things? And so we're going to be taking a look at this parable. And, you know, last week, people were very uncomfortable with the lesson because we ended up kind of without a lot of clarity. It was a very difficult and perplexing lesson. Christy, I think you and I both experienced that in our classes last week. I've got news for you. This week, they're going to be very uncomfortable for a different reason. This week, everybody's going to be uncomfortable because it's so clear what the message is. Why don't you give us an overview of the story of the parable of Lazarus?
Sure, Joe. So this week's parable is really a story of contrast. You've got a rich man and you've got a poor man, Lazarus. You've got the rich man who is clothed in finery, and you have Lazarus who is covered in sores. And Lazarus has positioned himself outside the gate or the door of the rich man. And it ends with the poor man ends up, he dies, and he is carried away by angels to be with Father Abraham. And the rich man also dies, and he is buried, and his destination is Hades. And so you've got the tale of two people, very, very different, and they end up in completely different places. And I think it's interesting to try to figure out, Joe, why do we think that the rich man ended up where he did, and why, and who can we relate to in this parable? So you want to talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Sure. I think that's a great first point, Christy. And when we talk about the rich man, I mean, Scripture gives us a tremendous amount of information about this man. We see that he was dressed in purple and fine linen, and we know that anybody who could afford to wear white under purple, that was the ultimate of indulgence, so to speak, just from the clothing. And we read about, you know, how he ate the very best, and you know, I guess, you know, we can assume that he socialized with the very best. In other words, this guy would have been the epitome of success in his day. And so when we think about that, you know, we think about what did he do wrong, because he obviously ended up in the place where he didn't want to end up. What caused that? And, you know, I think that the parable, Jesus wanted his disciples to understand that it was because of what he didn't do. It wasn't because of anything he did do. Listen, he didn't end up in Hades because he was wealthy. He ended up there, obviously, because he failed to see the needs of other humans that he could have helped out of his surplus. And so I think the first point for me was that, and again, I'm thinking about myself when I say this, all of us get caught up in our stuff, and a lot of times that can cloud our thinking about others. I mean, I get the feeling that this rich man was somewhat oblivious to this poor beggar living on his front porch, or outside of his gate. And so he just failed not only to help, but he failed to even see him. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Kristen?
Yeah, I agree with you, Joe, that I ask myself that, you know, how many Lazarus do I come in contact with in one day? Just if I were to draw a 5-mile circle from my house or even from around the church, you take these paths every day, and you've got so many things going on. You're distracted, or either you just choose to ignore because you don't want to be involved. And it really sort of struck me as, my responsibility, unlike the rich man, and I, how many times have I passed people? Probably numerous times. But I'm being called to respond, and that's sort of a root word for the title of this lesson, is responsibility. I'm being asked to have a response of some sort, and to stop and to not sort of hold on to my stuff and to my way or to my life, and to just look beyond. And how many times do I overlook people? Or I feel like maybe sometimes, Joe, maybe I'm judging people when I shouldn't be judging people. And I'm judging them based on a measuring stick from the modern world, not necessarily from God's yardstick in terms of what success is. And, we don't really know exactly what Lazarus did to end up where he did. But we know what the rich man did or didn't do. And in this case, it really was. He just overlooked and ignored the obvious. And speaking for myself, I probably do that on a daily basis.
Right.
I understand this point, and it does make me feel uncomfortable, but it also opens my eyes to thinking a little differently going forward. What can I do to correct that going forward? So it's nice to be called out and have a point resonate with you.
One of the things that I was thinking about that happens to us is compassion fatigue. I read that word in, it was either the teacher's book or the commentary, maybe it was a student book, but this whole idea that we become overwhelmed sometimes by all the needs around us. And so as a result of that, we either feel like our contribution is going to be insignificant, or we just feel like there's no way we can help. It's too big, and so we end up doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And I'm not defending the rich man here, even though I relate to him more than I do Lazarus. But I do think sometimes that we experience this compassion fatigue. Here was what I saw in the parable to address that. This guy, the rich man, he ended up in the wrong place. But what if he had just helped one person? What if he had just forgot about, we're not called to save the world, but we are called to love our neighbors. What if he had just looked out his front window and saw this beggar who was sick laying out there on the other side of the gate? What if he had just ministered to and helped that one person? Would he have ended up on the other side of the great chasm? It's an interesting thought. But I think it's very much a conviction for us that don't get caught up in getting overwhelmed by needs. Help a person. That's something we're all capable of doing.
Yeah, I agree, Joe. Sometimes it's just the small things. And like you said, I think it's in our lesson, it says, we, like you said, we're not called to save the world, but to touch or impact one person. And that may be one small moment of their day. And if you start to scale it down in those terms, it becomes something that you can sort of grab a hold of a whole lot better. And like you said, we're not called to save the world. And I think that another point happens to be about this gate. I'm very much into, I guess, metaphors and symbolism. And one of the things that I wrote down for this week, Joe, is that the gate swings both ways. And what gates do we put up in our lives to sort of protect ourselves, or we think we're protecting ourselves, when maybe we're really shutting others out. And certainly as a church, what gates do we put up? And I think you mentioned earlier, if someone were to come into our church that maybe they were not dressed the way we thought was acceptable, or maybe they felt uncomfortable that they didn't have an offering to give, or something to that effect. Does that gate swing freely on both sides, or are we the people like the rich man who just sort of walk through those doors and sort of ignore that person along the way? The gate for me was something that was just very, very symbolic. And how many times do you go in and out of a gate, or open or close a door, and you overlook something, or you overlook somebody? And to me, that's one of the emotional sides of this parable. Is that you want to be inclusive, you want to help others, but sometimes we put up these artificial gates to protect ourselves or to protect our stuff. So did you see anything with the gate, Joe?
No, I agree with you. I think that we need to be very aware of the gates that we build, because the gates in the chasm, the rich man had the gate to keep himself from being vulnerable to the needs of this man. In other words, Lazarus was on the other side of the gate. The gate protected the rich man from vulnerability, because that's what really happens. We don't want to make ourselves vulnerable, because once we start down that path, it's endless, and it's a threat to us, and yet it's what we call to do. In fact, I think that sets up our third point that you and I kind of talked about, which is the parable really teaches us about life in God's economy. And when we think about stewardship, we're to think about being stewards in God's economy. And there's a lot of role reversal that goes on here, right, Christie? I mean, looking at the rich man, he held on very tightly to his lifestyle, to his comfort, to all that he had built and probably earned and felt he deserved to benefit from. But he held on it so tightly, almost as if he did not realize that he wasn't going to carry it with him. In the end, he loses it anyway. Lazarus didn't have anything, and in the end, he gained everything. And it was interesting, the rich man says, send Lazarus back to tell my brothers not to make the same mistake I made. And it's also interesting that Father Abraham that says they're not going to make a mistake from lack of know-how any more than you did. So we get it wrong. We get into the world's economy, which is, let's build up our treasures here on earth. And this parable teaches us that you're going to lose all that stuff. Don't put your value there. That stuff's all going to be gone. You're not carrying it with you. You're not going to need it for starters. You're not carrying it with you. So.
Right. And Lazarus, he died and was blessed, and the other man, like you said, he died in misery, and he was constantly trying to figure out, how can I get out of this mess? All the things that he had and all the things he had acquired, Joe, that couldn't even help him out of his misery. And so when he called back and he said, hey, send Lazarus back, or make sure that he tells my brothers, it was almost like treating Lazarus as a servant to say, maybe he can get me out of this. Nothing that this man had on earth to get him out of where he was. And I think that just speaks volumes of God's economy of you can't take it with you, so you might as well not even try. And I think the other thing that I saw throughout this is that who is the person that's always talking in this? It's the rich man. And Lazarus is quiet, silent. He does not have a voice. And it's just interesting to me that the person who is just, he has everything, and then he has all the voice, and he dies a miserable death. And you've got Lazarus, who is quiet, minding his business out by the gate, not asking for anything, and really isn't even begging. And he goes and he rests comfortably with Father Abraham, and he's blessed and he's at peace. Very different, Joe, from how our earthly standards and yardstick would be measured, I think.
Well, Christy, I think in closing, the question I plan on asking my class this Sunday is, what does this parable teach? What is Jesus trying to get across to his disciples then and to his disciples now? What is Jesus telling us about our responsibility as stewards to others? And in my answer to that question, what I took away from this week was, I need to be careful not to think about helping the world, and I need to look for individuals. If I help just one person, I think that's my responsibility. Sometimes I think we try to allow ourselves to get overwhelmed by all the needs, and I need to just really focus on individuals and where I can where I can help people, where I can use my resources to help people in a way that shows God's love. So for me, it was just a reminder to think about helping individuals and don't get lost in kind of the global needs of the world. So that was it for me. How about for you? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I feel like that my responsibility is to respond. And what does that look like? What does a healthy response look like? And breaking that down for, like you said, not just, I've got to go out and save the world today, and I've got all this on my shoulders. What can I do for one person, someone that may be in my path every day that I just don't notice? And what kind of action can I take? And it doesn't mean that I have to necessarily monetarily give them anything. It may just be saying hello or giving them my time. It could be something very innocent, but how many people do I pass? I need to be more in tune with them than I need to be in tune with myself. So that was for me.
Well, this was a refreshing lesson to have one that was pretty clear after last week.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot for people to take away from this, and very, very, very many different things they can take away from it. Hopefully you and I have covered some of those for the folks who might be listening to this. Well, the good news is next week we're going to finish up the stewardship. That's not the good news, but we will be finishing this unit up. But the good news is we're going to talk about what are the blessings of being a faithful steward. So we're going to get into some good stuff. We're going to talk about why being a faithful steward blesses us. And so next week's lesson is called Reward, and we'll be in the 25th chapter of Matthew. So I hope for all of you listening, you'll come back and do this final lesson with Christy and I. I hope you have a great week this week. We'll see you next time. God bless you, and thank you for being with us today.